Two.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Wisdom's The Story of Thebes. I was just admitting to our co-panelists today that I've been extremely excited about this event. I just think that the more you study about Thebes, the more interesting it turns out to be, the more you want to know. And it's a vicious Theban cycle that I think would make Sophocles very happy. So I just want to say thank you for everybody for joining us today. I know many of you are already subscribers and readers of Classical Wisdom, but for those of you who are new to us, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, and we are a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And we have a free newsletter, events, webinars, all with the purpose of kind of highlighting how the ancient world is still super relevant in our modern lives, and how studying history, philosophy, and literature can do quite a big part in helping us kind of understand the chaos of our modern lives. Joining me as a co-host is our own Sean Kelly. Thank you, Sean, for joining us. He's our managing editor, a classicist in his own right, and is based up in Northern Ireland. And I am down here in South America, in Buenos Aires. So we cover quite the span of the globe just between the two of us. And I know I'm very proud that our Classical Wisdom community is super international. Regular events have people coming in from like 170 countries. And I think this event is no different. It's a real honor to be able to kind of connect classics lovers from literally around the globe. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Now, with that, I'm going to add Paul up. He's going to be our first speaker, and I will introduce him right now. Paul Cartledge is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow at Clare College, Cambridge. He's the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of some 30 books, and most recently, Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. He is also a commander of the Order of Honor of Greece. And can I just say, for those who have not read this book, I mean, it is your first go-to for understanding the Theban world, and it is beautiful, filled with stunning photos, and it's just a delight, as is Paul. It's always a pleasure having you. And so with that, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to begin with a series of thanks. So first of all, to you, Anya, for setting this up. I know how difficult it is to put all the pieces together, all the ducks in a row. And classical wisdom is, I think, probably a very good moniker for yourself, as well as, we hope, for what we're going to be disseminating and thinking about in the next, hour and a half or so. At any rate, I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, England, where it is extremely wet currently. But we've been having, as elsewhere in the world, very unseasonable weather. In other words, up to what we call 20, 21, 23, 25 degrees in October. It should really be down in the teens. Secondly, thanks to my fellow participants, some of whom are personally known to me, some I've only just managed to meet, and one of whom I've not yet actually seen physically on the screen. So Jamie Romm from Bard College, I hope he will be pitching up shortly. So I'm just the warm-up guy. I'm the curtain raiser. The main event, as it were, is going to follow. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, and mainly about my book and why I wanted to write it, and why, well, Anya was much too kind, but why you might find something of value if you do happen to read it. But my biggest thanks, I think, apart from to Anya, is to the audience. And it looks like on my screen it says 140 participants. And if the classical wisdom community really does extend to 170 out of the 193 nations which are signed up to the United Nations, that is a phenomenal achievement. At any rate, I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking to you. That's the thanks. Second of all, a little about me. and about my fairly now recent book, Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece, and why I decided why I wanted to write it. I am a historian of ancient Greece, an archaeo-historian, if you like. That portmanteau includes archaeology with history. I actually did an mainly archaeological doctorate way back when in Oxford in the 1970s. And I have been such an ancient historian of ancient Greece for over 50 years. My first book was published in 1979, and it was the book of my 1975 Oxford doctoral thesis. And that was on Sparta, early Sparta, especially from roughly the 13th century BC or BCE and the 4th century BCE of the ancient world. And I've since researched and published much more on Sparta. Some would say far too much more. And as I speak to you, I'm researching and writing yet another book, this time on archaic Sparta. But I've also written on much else in ancient Greece and on many other ancient Greek cities. And I think to begin with, it's probably worth reminding ourselves that there were about 1,000 political entities. Let's take a date of circa in the 5th and 4th centuries, scattered around the Mediterranean and around the Black Sea. Plato once said in one of his dialogues, like frogs or ants round a pond. And together, those 1,000 make up ancient classical Hellas. There was no ancient Greece in any sense. We might say there's a modern Greece, and then there must have been no, there was no single political entity in any way corresponding to modern Greece, the modern Greek state today. One of the most important of those cities other than Sparta was, I say, of course, Thebes. Thebai, it's a plural in ancient Greek. In modern Greek, they pronounce it Theba. The last syllable is a short E, as it were. So why did I want to write a book about Thebes, as opposed to teaching, lecturing, and all the other ways in which one disseminates your views and thoughts about a particular ancient place? Why a book? Well, 3 main reasons. First, to rescue ancient Greek Thebes from the condescension of a largely Athenian-dominated, Athenocentric posterity. Culturally snooty Athenians like to think of the Thebans and to refer to them sneeringly as Boeotian swine. Well, they were only half right, because the Thebans were Boeotians. Boeotia was the region in central Greece, the indispensable geopolitical framework within which all Theban history has to be understood. So you need to get some sort of grasp of history, geography, before you can get into the meat of ancient Thebes. And I've got no slides myself, partly because I know that the people who are coming after me have a ton of them. So you don't want to be over bombarded with visual material. The Athenians were quite wrong about all Thebans being mere pigs, that is, interested only in their bellies and not in the things of the mind. Probably the greatest lyric poet of classical Greece was a Theban. That's Pindaros in ancient Greek, Pindar. Probably the greatest player of the aulos, an instrument something like an oboe, a reeded instrument, was a Theban. His name was Pronomos. And Thebes produced at least 3 philosophers of significance. 2 of them were pupils of Plato in Athens, Cebes and Simmias. They're referred to in works of Plato, though their own works don't happen to survive. And the 3rd of them was Crates, or Crates, also in Athens, and he made great contributions to the development of the philosophy known as Cynicism. Well, that was my first reason. The Athenians got it wrong. They were snobs, and they were ethnocentric snobs. Second reason, why Thebes? Well, I happen to be not only a Democrat, and I've written on democracy, ancient and modern. But I'm also a believer in the federal form of government. Long story short, I believed before I started writing my book, and I still believe after writing it, that in the 4th century BC, BCE, the 300s, Thebes acquired a form of democratic constitution and was the senior partner in a mildly democratic Boeotian federal state. I also believed, and still believe, that both Athens in the 5th century BC and Sparta in the 6th, 5th, and 4th would have done well, they would have done better to practice some form of federalism in place of the kind of asymmetrical alliances that they did in fact practice, or as some of the allies would have thought, have imposed upon them as unequal partners. My third and final reason is directly related to those two previous ones. My ancient Greek history hero, this is a kind of parlor game. One's often asked, who are your favorite ancient Greeks, or your most favorite of all ancient Greek? Well, it's not, as you might have predicted, Lycurgus of Sparta. Did he ever exist? The jury's still out on that. A lot of people have thought he did exist and was a seriously great legislator, but I leave that aside. Nor is my ancient Greek history hero Pericles of Athens, terrific democrat, of course, but also an imperialist. And I'll shortly be writing a biography of him for a series that I edit for another British publisher. My history hero is Epaminondas, or as he's usually done in Latin, Epaminondas of Thebes. Sadly, very sadly, the biography of him written by the king of ancient biographers, Plutarch, a Boeotian, not a Theban, has not survived the ravages of time and taste. But we do glimpse enough from the sources that do survive of Epaminondas, both the man and the terrific general and diplomat. We know enough of the man and his career to know that he was a very great man, both on and off the battlefield. He was a terrific strategist and tactician. He won, crucially, a couple of absolutely major decisive battles against Sparta, which is much to the point. He was a liberator. He liberated thousands of enslaved persons from the domination of Sparta, which had gone on for hundreds of years. He too was, like myself, a federalist. He promoted federalism outside as well as inside Boeotia. And last but not least, he was a philosopher. Specifically, he was a follower of Pythagoreanism. Almost nothing about what Pythagoreanism or living a Pythagorean way of life may have meant to him or to those with whom he interacted. But we do know that full-on Pythagoreans were unconventional in various ways. One of them being that they were vegetarians and they refused to take part in animal blood sacrifice. Anyhow, for me, as for a certain Walter Raleigh, some of you will have heard of him. He was executed in the Tower of London, but just before he died, he was working on a history of the world, part of which still survives. And so for him, as for me, Epaminondas was the go-to greatest of the ancient Greeks. So there are my three reasons, my three main reasons for writing the book I did and in the way I did. But what sort of a book is it? By which I mean, to what genre of historiography does it belong? It's published by Macmillan in the United Kingdom and by Abrams in the States, which tells you it's not published by a university press. So it's what's called an academic trade monograph or book, aimed primarily not at even my students, not at my colleagues, but at you. In other words, the kind of people I imagine are currently tuned in and listening to this event, the proverbial intelligent general readers of the world. One final word of warning today, and this I shared with Anya before I went on to talk to you. Book was first published, and you saw the hardback edition in 2020. Happily, very soon, it was republished in softback, in paperback. Happily for two reasons. The first is obvious, it's much cheaper. And so in principle, if people buy books at all these days, they're more likely to want to buy a cheaper book than a more expensive book. However, the other point is this: happily for me, I was able to correct only a very few, I hasten to add, mistakes in the first hardback printing. And one of them caused me great shame when it was pointed out to me, and I still feel retrospectively a certain amount of shame. As every schoolboy, this is an old sort of trope, every schoolboy and schoolgirl used to know, Thebes, the city of Thebes in Greece, was founded by a non-Greek Phoenician prince, a man called Cadmos. And he did so not because he got the idea, you know what I need to do or want to do, I must found a city in Greece. No, he'd come to mainland Greece from his homeland of where is roughly now today Lebanon, what's left of Lebanon, to mainland Greece because his sister, a woman called Europe, who gives her name to Europe, there's an irony, an Asiatic woman who gives her name to the continent of Europe. She had been, well, politely abducted, but more particularly probably raped and snatched by none other than Zeus, great father Zeus, chief of all the Olympian Greek gods. Now, Zeus had his way with human females in a variety of means. A shower of gold was one. But in the case of Europe, he transformed himself into a certain beast, a being. And in my original version, those of you who have read only that, you will see I wrote into an eagle. Completely wrong. He transformed himself into a bull, and in some versions, a white bull. So there you are. I'm very relieved now that if you get the paperback version, you'll get the correct version. So I've talked about myth there, and I move quickly on to the book itself, another 5-10 minutes or so. Continuously inhabited for 5 millennia, at one point the most powerful city in all ancient Greece, Thebes has often been overshadowed by its better-known rivals, Athens, Sparta, and later Macedon. Indeed, it's often been confused, this is a source of great upset to anybody who studies Greek Thebes, with Egyptian Thebes. I won't go into why the Valley of Kings is in what the ancients called Thebes. It's a complicated story. Sometimes Thebes, ancient Greek Thebes, has even been completely forgotten. And that gave rise to the subtitle of my book, The Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. In the book, therefore, I attempt to bring the city vividly back to life, arguing that it is central to our understanding of the ancient Greeks' achievements, whether politically or culturally, and thus central to our own culture and civilization. But there were actually 2 cities of ancient Greek Thebes: the city of myth on the one hand, the city of history on the other. Now, that fact is not unique to ancient Greek Thebes. You could say the same, for example, about Sparta and about Athens. My point is that it's especially true of ancient Greek Thebes, which had a genius for generating myths about itself and about characters who are of Theban either origin or descent. but who also, the Thebans, also had the galling misfortune to see their own myths, their own locally produced myths, considered inferior to those of other Greek cities. For example, 4 Theban epic poems were composed, none of which survives as such, only bits and pieces of quotations, whereas Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they survive as such. And so that's what I mean by saying the Thebans had a genius at producing myths, but not so much in transmitting them as such to us. On the other hand, they were appropriated, you might say misappropriated, but at any rate, you could say in a very brilliant way, reworked by non-Thebans. And of course, the most famous example is the Athenian dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, who took Theban myths and then reworked them for Athenian audiences to make some of the most famous tragedies, Oedipus, Tyrannos, the Bacchae of Euripides, or the 7 Against Thebes of Aeschylus, just to give some examples. Now, according to myth, as I've already said, the city was founded when Cadmos sowed dragon's teeth into the ground, and warriors sprang forth, ready not only to help build the fledgling city, but also to defend it from all comers. It was hero god Hercules, that is Heracles in Greek, his birthplace. It was the haunt of the Sphinx that you see depicted on the cover of my book, whose riddle Oedipus solved, thereby winning the crown of Thebes and the king's widow in marriage, little knowing that the widow was a widow because he had killed her husband, who was his natural father. Archetypal, eternally influential, Theban. So much for the city of myth. The remaining bit, I will confine myself to the city of history. I say much, of course, in the book about the varying legacies of Thebes. The Oedipus myth is one of the most obvious. But I'm also, because I'm a historian, very interested in the prehistory and history of ancient Thebes, which I find every bit as rich and fascinating as its mythic origins. From the construction of a Mycenaean late Bronze Age palace on the Cadmeia, that's the name given to the Acropolis of Thebes, huge Acropolis, in the 14th century, right down to the historical city's near total extinction in the 4th century BC in 335. There is almost too much of interest for one book. In between the 14th and the 4th centuries, Thebes had its great successes, such as the establishment and re-establishment of regional federal structures, at first oligarchic, later democratic. But it also had its great disasters. I'll give you just 2. In 480, when the Persians invaded, the Thebans decided to throw in their lot on the side of the Persians against the resisting Greeks. For that, they earned themselves an undying miasma of negativity. And in 335, as I've mentioned, Alexander the Great, as he became, was able to exploit that myth of Theban treachery in 480 as part of his propaganda reasons for destroying the city of Thebes almost totally. It was, of course, rebuilt 20 years later, but never achieved the fame and the achievements as its classical predecessors. So historical Thebes, to sum up, was rarely boring, often illuminating, certainly doesn't deserve the oblivion visited upon it in antiquity, and still, sadly, to some extent, in modernity. In antiquity, the reason for Thebes' oblivion or being forgotten was largely a combination of the far greater fame of Sparta, Athens, even Macedon, and also the enmity of, in particular, Athens, a near neighbor, a too near neighbor, who also rubbed the salt, Attic salt, into the Thebans' wounds by insulting them. And that memory, I hope, I've done my best at any rate to try to erase. So if you have been, thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm just going to pin myself. Okay, so we've got a few questions for you before we jump into the archaeology of Thebes. And if you have any more, you can feel free to add them into the chat. The first one is just a very practical one to get you started. Has your book been translated into Greek?
It has not. And that doesn't necessarily mean it won't ever, because quite often things I've had translated have been done up to 10 years after I originally published them in English. So I think it's 4 or 5 of my books. I've had 4 or 5 different publishers over the years, and some of them have been, shall we say, better than others. So don't, for example, read the Sparta translation, which I'm told is not a good one, of The World of Sparta, the Warrior Heroes. It comes out in American English.
Well, translation is an art and a skill of and of itself. So as I think all of us classics lovers appreciate both in modernity and antiquity. Now, I'd love to talk a bit about some of the philosophies that you mentioned coming out of Thebes. Was Pythagoreanism and Cynicism popular amongst the people as well, or was it just sort of individuals that came from there?
No, it's quite right. Because they are individualist philosophies, they're by definition a minority taste. And so if you talk about religion, which of course has philosophical elements, there is an overlap in the case of Pythagoreanism between an everyday lifestyle, which you base on certain tenets, which you could call quasi-religious. They're certainly moral. Pythagoreanism is both a way of life and a religious way of being. And it was wildly popular in one particular city in southern Italy because Pythagoras, the hero who founded the sect, really, you could call it almost a cult. And he was worshipped after his death as a hero. This was a form whereby the Greeks translated somebody entirely human. So both Pythagoras' parents were human beings. He was wholly human, but after his death, he was worshipped as if he was semi-divine, that is, above the station of mere mortal, but not an immortal god. He was, in Greek terms, a kind of hero. Now, the number of Pythagorean adepts, or addicts, one might call, in other words, people who eschewed one of the most common forms of being Greek, which is to worship the gods or goddesses through animal blood sacrifice. You sacrifice or slaughter a certain kind of animal on an altar, and the blood runs down, and then you cook it, and the smoke is what the god or goddess gets, but the meat is what the human worshippers get. All that, for Pythagoreans, was a no-no. It was taboo. And so by espousing that form of outlook on life, you are actually going to be cutting yourself off from that very central part of what it is to be a Greek and what it is to be a member of a Greek political community. On the other hand, cynicism is a far more restricted and almost sort of make it up as you go along, because it's in itself by definition negative. So why are cynics called cynics? Because they're like dogs, the Greek word kuon, kunos. You bark and you are a kind of anarchist. You reject all sorts of conventions of everyday behavior, which are assumed to be not just conventional, in other words, handed down, but actually good. You've chosen to accept and to adopt them. And the founder of cynicism is a man called Diogenes. He came from the southern shore of the Black Sea. I was saying that Greeks lived all around the Black Sea, all around the Mediterranean. He came from Sinope, which is Sinop, and he did also migrate to mainland Greece, to Corinth, where allegedly Alexander the Great had an encounter with him. And it wasn't a particularly, shall we say, sophisticated philosophy in the way we might say that Platonic ethics or Platonic metaphysics is extremely sophisticated, or Aristotelian philosophy is, because there are no famous, and people can correct me, but ancient texts, which are kind of the sort of thing when you are meeting someone and say, look, I'd like to learn a bit about cynicism. Can you direct me to the principal texts in Cynic philosophy? More, it was a philosophy of action than of belief and thought.
I would recommend reading, if people are interested in studying a bit more about cynicism, Mark Usher's book, How to Say No. He uses a lot of letters and such regarding the cynics, but as you say, there's no seminal text. But it is an interesting overview of different cynics. But bringing us back to our theme of Thebes, this is a good question with regards to when Thebes was refounded after Alexander's destruction of the city. How much do we know about the process, how the former inhabitants were gathered, assuming most of the new inhabitants were the original dispossessed Thebans who physically carried out the reconstruction, etc.?
Well, one has to say that a lot of Thebans were killed in the process of Alexander and his troops getting hold of Thebes. And then a whole load, I mean, the sources say up to 20,000, even more, were sold abroad. So they would have had to come back from whoever their masters, their new owners were, in 315 or so. They would have had to be ransomed by their relative. I mean, we don't actually have evidence about this. The practice of what's sometimes called herbicide. I've actually just quite recently published an article on this Greek unfortunate habit of destroying whole communities and therefore leaving a lot of people homeless. And the Thebans are just a classic example, but they're not unique in having to suffer this. The fact of the matter is, apart from an inscription, which of course features in the book, whereby different cities raised funds to support the restoration of Thebans and therefore help towards the not just rebuilding of private houses, but in particular the rebuilding of such public structures, walls, for example, as had fallen into disrepair in the 20 years. Now, one thing that's said about Alexander's destruction is that being very religious, we might say superstitious, he didn't want to get the gods of Thebes against him. Just as he's going to go off into Asia, he's going to need all the divine support he can get when he takes on the Persians, especially because one of his arguments is going to be, I am representing those Greeks who were sacrilegiously treated by the Persian barbarians 145 years ago, who destroyed the temples of the Athenians and others, but especially famously, notoriously, on the Acropolis, under the Acropolis of Athens. So he's not going to want to alienate. Now, the main gods of Thebes were Dionysus and Heracles, I've already mentioned. Heracles was a hero, but he became a god. And so those shrines, allegedly, Alexander ordered to be spared. Whether they were actually all spared, in other words, every sacred space in Thebes, who can say? Because, of course, the new city was rebuilt smack on top of the old one. And there was one other exception, this is in the sources in Plutarch, where Pindar had lived and where his descendants still lived in 335. That house was specifically spared. And the reason is not stated specifically, it's not spelled out, but I'm pretty sure it was because all the things that Pindar did, regardless of what you think of his politics in terms of democracy or oligarchy or aristocracy, he was the poet of Pan-Hellenic achievement in the four main Pan-Hellenic festivals, the Olympics, the Isthmians, the Pythians, the Nemeans. And so his four collections of Olympic odes and so on and so forth, they survived and they were widely known. And so he was, as it were, the voice of Hellenism in 480 when the Persians came. Now, there's the irony that, of course, his own city actually took the wrong side. But nevertheless, that didn't bother Alexander. He was wanting to make a point about, I think, Pindar's celebration of Greek culture, which, what is it to be Greek? Well, one of the ways of being Greek is going to the Olympic Games, going to the Pythian Games, either as a competitor or as a spectator.
That's beautiful that Pindar's house was spared. I mean, I love when you get examples of the sort of humanity coming out of the whole violence and war and the respect for literature and that. We're running a little bit out of time, but I want to ask two very quick questions, if I may. And these are specifically to you, Paul. Would you be willing and able to write a book on Epaminondas?
Yes, I've thought about that, but there isn't enough material. You'd have to write a life and times. There are only about 3 individuals from antiquity, Cicero, Augustine, about whom you can write a modern biography, which is a psychobiography, an internal life, as well as an external life. There are very, very few ancients who preserve the right kind of evidence about them so that you can talk about them as individual characters, not just as public figures. So Epaminondas doesn't have the life, whereas his, as it were, sidekick or coadjutant, the other great Theban of the time, what did have a life written of him by Plutarch, and his name was Pelopidas, literally means a descendant of Pelops, who was actually the man who gave his name to the Peloponnesos, the island of Pelops. But at any rate, Pelopidas's life does survive, and there's a lot of reference to Epaminondas, and you can sort of substitute, to a certain extent, what is said about Pelopidas with the name of Epaminondas, but it's not enough. Plutarch wrote a life. Sadly, it's one of the only 4 out of the 50 that doesn't survive. It's, you know, the luck of the draw.
It's such a shame the things that have been lost. Okay, very, very last question, and then we're going to move on to Stephanie. Is anything other than the Zeus Europa era revised in the paperback? So very much enjoyed and appreciate my hardcover copy. I couldn't wait for it to come out paperback. Wondering if there's any summary of differences between the editions.
Send me an email and I'll tell you. There are only 4 or 5, and the others are somewhat trivial, where I put the wrong way round. Let's say Thebes attacked Sparta, and it should have been Sparta attacked Thebes. That sort of level of trivia, which you can very quickly pick up. So nothing substantive, no.
So we should, if you want to look for Christmas gifts, then stick to the hardback because it's so beautiful.
It is nicely printed, I have to say that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure as always. And I hope everybody enjoyed the first introduction to Thebes. I'm now going to bring Sean up and Stephanie Larson, and Sean will be introducing our next speaker. Thank you again, Paul.
Hello, I'm Sean, and more importantly, our next guest is Stephanie Larson. Stephanie Larson is a professor of classics at ancient Mediterranean studies at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, a Greek cultural historian with special interests in the construction and maintenance of regional and gender identities in classic Greece. Professor Larson co-directs the Thebes Ismenian Synergesia excavation project with Professor Kevin Daly. I hope I pronounced everything correctly there.
You did wonderfully.
I just thought I'd go for it.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you to Paul for his wonderful speech there about all of the different Boeotian aspects he touched on. I'm going to show you a few images of some of the things that Paul so nicely introduced you to. And so I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you can tell me if you can see the screen. Can you see it? Yeah?
Yeah, I can see
Okay,
it, yeah.
great. All right, so I'm going to just tell you a few things. I'm an archaeologist, partially by training. I'm also a philologist. I sort of look at everything Theban and Boeotian. I've been essentially obsessed with Thebes and Boeotia ever since I wrote my dissertation and turned it into a book about collective identity in Boeotia in the Archaic period, which means the 6th century BC. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, great.
Yep, you sound great. Thank you.
Great. Paul had mentioned that Thebes is the city of myth, so I'll just show you just a few images that pertain to the things that he discussed. Thebes is, of course, in addition to exporting its myths, it's the birthplace of many, many people. The area around Thebes is the birthplace of Oedipus, whom you see on this very famous vase. Of course, he having answered the Sphinx riddle and the whole story that goes along with that. We also have the birthplace, Thebes is the birthplace of Dionysus, who is the daughter or the son of Semele, who herself has connections to Thebes. And so Dionysus could be said to hail from Thebes as well. Very important to think about that also. And a lot of these vases that you're seeing here are produced elsewhere outside of Thebes. I will show you some Theban products, of course, as well, too. But just to note that everyone knew about Dionysus as having come from Thebes. Everyone knew about Oedipus coming from Thebes, and everyone knew about Cadmus coming from Thebes, whom you see here, the traditional founder of the city, who was in search of his sister Europa from Phoenicia and came to the place called Thebes. And in fact, the Ismenion Hill, where I have done some excavation, supposedly is where he killed the dragon and sewed the dragon's teeth into the ground, and out popped the fully armed aristocratic founders of the aristocratic families for the rest of Theban history. And I'm just showing you a few images of that. It's a very popular scene of Cadmus killing the dragon. I like this one the best because look at that snake. He doesn't really look very, very scary, but there he is, the dragon. So Thebes is known from antiquity as having many rivers. It's well watered. We have the Dirki stream on one side, we have the Chrysaroa stream on the other, we have the Ismenos River slightly to the east of the Cadmea, and that is basically the continuously inhabited area of central Thebes. We would, if you were in Lebanon or Jordan or Israel, you'd call it a tel, T-E-L, a continuously inhabited place where the material culture is all there in layers all around the modern city. Thebes also has many hills. I'm circling some of them on the screen here for you. It's surrounded by hills that usually contained Mycenaean, which means 2nd millennium BCE, burial areas, graves areas, and that's important. One of the most interesting graves that we have from ancient Greece in general is this one. It's on one of the hills to the east of Thebes. It's called today the Tomb of the Sons of Oedipus. It's really fantastic because it actually has 2 passageways into the grave itself, the burial area itself, and this corresponds sweetly with, and not so sweetly, with the myth of civil war from the family of Oedipus, of Polynices and Eteocles, who killed each other in the 7 against Thebes battle. Anyway, so that's kind of interesting too. We also have a lot of archaeology here in Thebes that is yet to be found because excavations have tended to be born of necessity rather than of small scale instead of systematic excavation. So because the place is continuously inhabited, we have only been able to excavate certain places. They're called rescue excavations. And because, people still live here and they love their city and we love them and we don't want to push them out. And there's a lot of things that we have to worry about in that regard. Right in the center of the Cadmea, you see here on this slide, there's a complex from the 2nd millennium BCE, Mycenaean, so-called the House of Cadmus. We don't really have Cadmus's diary from this period. He left it here. He didn't, of course, write anything like that, but so we call it the House of Cadmus. It's kind of like not really true. We don't know who really lived here, but we do have evidence for an old palace, a new palace, lots of different places in these structures that you see, lots of storage for weaponry, storage of other things like what you see on this slide. There's a hoard of lapis lazuli from amazing more ancient cultures like Assyrian seals, Hittite seals, hurry-in seals. And we think that the Thebans were keeping these as for raw materials and things like that. But Thebes is absolutely full of this kind of amazing remnant. And if you are interested in looking at these things very close up, some of these pictures I've taken today from the book that I've cited here today, the Lazis Public Benefit Foundation Museum Cycle. You can find this online. I've put the address down at the bottom for you, but you can just Google it as the Lazis Foundation Museum, Archaeological Museum of Thebes. They have amazing images in there of all the periods of Theban history. So I encourage you to look at that. Also in the Mycenaean period, the Bronze Age, we have from Thebes really important linear B tablets that attest to all sorts of people, names of people, individual people. We have painted linear B on jars exported from Crete that contained olive oil, amazing things. We have all sorts of other things that I'm just showing you a few tiny pieces of the archaeology of Thebes. We have here female weavers attested in linear B. We have a systematic weight thing that's on display at the Thebes Museum, and all sorts of other lists that would interest you. We have frescoes that were found in the palace, frescoes from the House of Cadmus. This is called the procession fresco, which rival frescoes from other more well-known Mycenaean centers. And honestly, if we could excavate the tell of Thebes, we would be able to rewrite Greek history. I truly believe Sparta and Athens were important, but Thebes was also extremely important in the Mycenaean period. And I'm just showing you a few more images of some of the wealthy grave goods that were found in some of the Theban graves around on those hills that I mentioned from the Mycenaean period. My favorite one is this little Sphinx ivory box on the lower left. Sphinxes obviously being a particularly salient image for Theban mythology and history because of Oedipus and that story. Here are just some more beautiful things, and you can find all of this in the Latsis book if you like. I'll keep moving. We also have some horse paraphernalia. We have dishes, we have spearheads, we have strigils, we have all sorts of things from the real life of ancient Thebans. And so I encourage you to look at that book and think about it. I'm showing you these two seal stones because I really also think that a lot of the imagery from Thebes matches some of what we know from elsewhere in Greece. Like on the left, these two lions flanking each other remind us of the Mycenaean lions from the Lion Gate. And we also have a Sphinx here on a seal stone, a clay seal from Thebes, just re-emphasizing the importance of Sphinx imagery coming from here because of the story of Oedipus. Some of the archaeological remains, I showed you the site plan of the House of Cadmus, but here are some pictures of what you can see on the ground in Thebes that has been excavated in rescue excavations. What you're looking at here are a jumble of walls. You can see some of the classical walls down in the lower left. And you can see even some of the medieval walls too, sort of extending over the Mycenaean remains in the center part of the lower right picture. And in the very top picture, you can see, in fact, the modern walls that still exist on top of the ancient tell, the ancient Cadmia. And that's a really important thing to think about. Remember that everybody still lives here. Across the street from this site, there are new excavations going on every summer under the leadership of Vasilis Arivantinos, a former head of archaeology in Thebes. Now we have a very nice, wonderful new team, and I'll talk about the museum in just another minute. But across the street, they're finding a lot of amazing things from every period. And so you know that if you stub your toe on something ancient in Thebes, it's going to be an impressive thing. And so I really encourage you to think about all the things that are left to find. This is a reconstruction of what Thebes could have looked like from archaeology, whatever that website is. I kind of like it. It's sort of, every city looks the same. It's a walled city. But anyway, just so you can see, Thebes also controlled a lot of plains and agricultural ground, which helps us understand why it was so wealthy. It could feed itself very easily. And so I'm going now down again to giving you an overview of the map area of Thebes and the Cadmia. You can see it in the Google Maps here, and the rivers again. And I'm going to take you down to the southeast part of Thebes and talk a little bit more about a couple sites that I'm more familiar with. And one is here by the Electra Gate. And that is the Theban Heracleon. Paul had mentioned Heracles as having been born in Thebes. That's a very common story, but we also know that we have a sanctuary site dedicated to him that was excavated in the early 2000s right outside this gate, the Electric Gate. And this is what it looks like today. And it's a rescue excavation. There's an apartment building on the right. There's an apartment building on the back. There's an apartment building on the left. And so it's very tempting to think about wanting to take down some of these buildings and paying, of course, the people a fair price for their property and this kind of thing to continue the excavation of this place. One of the amazing things that came out of this excavation was this terracotta head of Heracles, over life size. So we have an over life size, probably statue of Heracles in this place. We also have some of the very first narrative scenes in geometric art from all of Greece. In this, this is a very famous example. It's my favorite thing actually from antiquity, frankly. You see a centaur here being shot with arrows from the other side of the vase, which is horribly broken off, but you can actually see an arrow and bow and arrow set and a foot coming from the far left. You see that. And you have the centaur holding a young maiden in his arms. And this is probably the story of Heracles and Deianira and the centaur Nessus. And so this is one of the very earliest narrative scenes we have in all of Greek art from Thebes, possibly also made in Thebes. People have done studies of the ceramic that this vase is made from and suggested that, which is wonderful. So I just urge you to think about Thebes as a place that is producing early Greek art and worshiping Heracles in a very real way, very early, earlier than many other city-states. We also know that this is Heracles because we found the name written Heracles on all sorts of different pottery at the site. It's always nice when you have a name to a place in archaeology. And I'm just going to show you a picture of the Thebes Museum. The Archaeological Museum has won many prizes. It was recently reopened. It was expanded with EU money. The head of the museum, Alexandra Harami, is a wonderful director, and she has made this museum really, really stellar. And what they do at this museum is they show you everything in a diachronic way. I urge you to visit it. But they don't only show you the most famous things, they also show you very, very simple objects from everyday life as well. As you can see down on the right, there's some hobnails from shoes and things like that. So they make a very good effort of sort of democratizing the presentation of all of their material. But it's a fantastic museum, and I urge you to go see it. Going back down again to Southeast Thebes, now we talked about the Heracleon. I'm going to go outside the Electric Gate again and go down to our excavation just to give you a couple tidbits of what we have found there. The Ismenion Hill is the place where we have our excavation the last 10 years. We've dug it. Now we're in study seasons. It's a very famous place, not only because a lot of objects came from it in the late 19th century that were sold to various museums. This is one of the most famous objects that came from the site, the Manticlos Apollo, which is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's a very early inscribed object talking about Apollo, and has a sort of dactylic hexameter feel to it, which is really lovely. We also have some other objects from around Thebes that attest to people like King Croesus having come there and made dedications. So we have famous people coming to the Ismenion. It's a very important place. When we first got there, we did a bunch of different geophysical tests, and this is just a map to show you all the places on the hill that had geophysical anomalies. This is something that you do in archaeology as a matter of practice now. And this is the temple of Apollo Ismenios, probably. There is some debate about that, but I really do believe it's Apollo Ismenios on the Ismenion Hill. It's a 4th century temple, so it probably is connected to Paul's favorite, Epaminondas, the general, who defeated the Spartans in 371, and this temple was probably rebuilt and sort of shored up for that victory. And so I kind of think of this temple in this current phase right here in the 4th century remains as Epaminondas's temple, which is quite nice. This is how we cleaned it up. We recorded everything. We are interested especially in the superstructure of the temple that you see in some of these pictures. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back for a second. This is the superstructure. You see some of the column capitals, some of the entablature rocks that fell right in these pictures. Here you go, lots of different kinds of ways of showing this digitally. This is also the famous place where Pindar writes about the Thebans coming to celebrate their ritual of the Daphnephoria, the celebration of the victor, to give the young boy a laurel wreath for Apollo, and it was made famous in a lot of later paintings that sort of romanticize the place. It's very famous also for having some of its superstructure inscribed with directions as to how to put it together. You see a piece here that says on the bottom of the column exo, which means put this on the outside. This side goes on the outside. It's like a Lego, I guess, a little Lego direction for us all as architects and people putting the temple together. So that's really neat. That piece still exists on the site today. Another thing that you might like to know about this temple is that it was decorated with sphinxes. This is one of the sphinxes that came from the site that is now in the Louvre, and we went to study it and did some photogrammetry, and we're preparing to publish her in our next publication about the temple itself. And of course, it makes total sense for sphinxes to be adorning the temple of the famous Theban general Epaminondas in the 4th century. We also found a vase on the site that has sphinxes on it, which is a very strange thing because this kind of a scene usually depicts a different kind of monster, not a sphinx. And so that's also in the Thebes Museum now on permanent display. I have an article about that. If anyone would like to read that, I can put the link in the chat, or you can email me later. One of the other things that's interesting about this temple of Epaminondas is that the earlier versions of it, at any rate, were built right on top of Mycenaean tombs. So we think that the Thebans were very concerned with their heritage as Bronze Age Mycenaean kinds of heroic figures. And that's an important thing to think about in terms of the placement of the temple. I'm just showing you a few images of more of the architecture that we've reconstructed and measured. The column capitals, we have found one of them also built into a nearby church of St. Gregory. And some of the triglyph and column fragments that we have here, we're going to publish a chapter on just the architecture of the temple in our final publication. And we have found even the smallest, tiniest bits of the temple, and that helps us understand exactly the dimensions of the temple. And last but not least, I would like to mention that it's not all just ancient Greece that is important in terms of Theban history. The Thebans had a very rich medieval history, Byzantine history. And so I would just like to put that out there, that the history doesn't end when Justinian comes to power. History continues on. And Thebes was a very cosmopolitan center, and in fact, one of the most well-watered places to produce silk for Constantinople in all of the Byzantine periods. So I just wanted to put a shout out for the Byzantines in Thebes. And that is pretty much all I have to say. I just wanted to share some of those little bits with you. And now I will stop sharing my screen and take questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was absolutely fascinating, and so much information. So I think probably starting to one thing I really love about archaeology is it's sort of like a beautiful juxtaposition or like intersection of history and science and technology, but also the mythology. And I mean, you really have to know your mythology well to be able to understand what you're looking at. So I've got a few questions to start us off with regards to the mythology. The first one was, the dragon images look more like serpents. Were dragons antiquity different from our modern conception of dragons? And I will say I've seen that a lot too, like Jason in the Golden Fleece, you see a lot that look just more snaky than dragony.
That's a great question, but the word Draco is actually a Greek word meaning snake. And so it is true that the Greek conception of the dragon was really snake-like. And it sort of morphed, I suppose, into later European mythology to looking like more of a Tyrannosaurus Rex or something. I'm not sure how that happened, but the Greeks definitely saw the dragon, the snake, as the actual Draco. And of course, there's Draco Malfoy in the Harry Potter books too.
There's another few ones about the procession mural was very reminiscent of the Minoan figures, and the sphinxes looked a lot like harpies. I mean, is there any kind of correlation between any of those, or is this different?
Well, there's a lot of different kinds of monsters in Greek mythology, harpies included, griffins, sphinxes. And a lot of these characters are female in some ways, although we do have representations in iconography of male sphinxes. That's interesting to think about. But I don't think that harpies are necessarily related to sphinxes. They're just all in a huge consortium of monstrous figures in Greek mythology, to my mind.
And have you ever heard of the theories or ideas that in the Oedipus story, the Sphinx was originally a female highway robber?
Yes, of course, in that story, she's actually kind of producing a plague in Thebes at the time, and she's a very dangerous creature and sits there and waits to snatch people. And there are stories, I think I read somewhere once that one of the sort of ways in which you would keep little kids in check would be to tell them, oh, don't act out, someone's going to come grab you. It could be a sphinx, grabbing you. And we do have some representations in iconography of sphinxes actually carrying off humans. And that's very interesting. So yes, she's a very dangerous figure, and she's sitting at the side of the road, possibly on top of her column, really, really causing a lot of trouble.
Much more terrifying, than Elf on the Shelf or something.
Much more.
Continuing with the Sphinx just for a moment, generally the Sphinx is a funerary image. Would that have been true in Thebes as well?
Well, that's an interesting question. We do have a lot of sphinxes on top of columns as funerary markers. That's a very good question in terms of the relationship to the Oedipus story that the Sphinx of Thebes actually has. And I would say that you could read it that way. The Sphinx is a very dangerous creature, as I just said. She's causing a plague in Thebes. And in fact, when Oedipus solves her riddle, she hurls herself off of her column or off of the side of the mountain. There is a mountain outside of Thebes today, even still, called Sphinx Mountain, so she commits suicide because her riddle has been solved. And so there's a lot of death and morbidity associated with her in general. But a sphinx is a general kind of monster. It's not just the Sphinx of Thebes. There are sphinxes everywhere, and it was certainly an ancient Near Eastern motif before it became a Greek motif.
With regards to all these Theban myths, and I mean, they are so fundamental, and they're kind of the ones that have entered into almost pop culture. When you're doing the archaeological digging, I mean, are you finding proof of any of these Theban myths?
Well, I don't know if one could go as far as to say proof. Some things are suggestive. The double dromos, the double road into that amazing Mycenaean tomb is interesting in light of the fact that we have two brothers who die in the 7 against Thebes, 2 of Oedipus's family. The fact that we have sphinxes decorating this temple is suggestive. I can't say there's any proof ever, but there's always a little kernel of something in any of the Greek mythologies that help us understand. And so we just have to take the whole picture and leave those little suggestions as they are, thinking wistfully about if we could ever have any proof. But I think that if we were able to dig the entire city of Thebes, we would find a lot of things that would surprise us and perhaps confirm some of the stories that we think we know.
Going back, by the way, that would be very exciting, but I do appreciate we have lots of people even joining us from Thebes, so I'm sure we understand, appreciate the dynamic of respecting houses and getting to find out the history. Mm-hmm. Going back to the procession mural for a moment, the figures, as our commenter said, was quite reminiscent to the Minoans. Was there any connection to the Minoan civilization?
Well, Thebes was a Mycenaean citadel and area, just like Pylos, just like Knossos, etc. So surely these Bronze Age Mycenaeans had interchanges with earlier Minoans, possibly as artists, possibly living alongside each other in a way, just like the other Mycenaean citadels did. But as far as I know, we don't have any direct evidence in Thebes that there was a huge contingent or anything of Minoans living there, but it's just the same as any other Mycenaean Bronze Age center in terms of how they interacted with the Minoan population.
Sticking with the Bronze Age, I noticed the statue that you showed of a woman having the archaic smile is Theban. Could you comment on the emergence of the archaic smile?
Oh gosh, that's a big question that's outside of Thebes. Well, I mean, we all know the statues from the 7th and the 6th centuries BC have that kind of beautiful, placid look on their faces that almost looks like a smile or just a calmness to them. And we see it a lot, of course, in the statuary in the Acropolis Museum that now is down south of the Parthenon, the new Acropolis Museum. I don't know exactly what it means. I'm not an art historian per se, so I'm sure other people have more to say about that. But I do love that period of sculpture more than any other. I find the calmness that little smile indicates sort of magical. But I think I would actually prefer your audience to read a real book on art history to get that answer.
Yeah, that was a big one. So for more into the realm of archaeology, are there archaeological remains of ancient theatrical space that one finds in Delphi or Athens, given to the Dionysian legacy in Thebes? Any remains of Dionysian ritual space or sanctuary?
That is a great question. So far, we do not really know exactly where the theater was, and people are always speculating about it. We think it's probably over on the west side near the I think it's near the Church of Ayatriada, although there are other places it could also be. So no, we don't have the theater from Thebes, and we don't have a lot of Dionysian places in the actual Theban center. We do have some other places outside of Thebes in general Boeotia that do show hero worship and things that with types of vases that are associated with Dionysus, like the Cantharos, which is a vase that has two handles coming up. It's all black, glazed, a really beautiful kind of Boeotian indigenous kind of shape. And so we do have some evidence for Dionysus being worshipped in a way, or being celebrated together with the humans in sort of hero worship outside of Thebes.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. I've got several more questions for you, but I fear we're running out of time. But I want to thank you again for joining us. And it's great to see like another layer of Thebes, literally layers. And it's fantastic to think of how many cool, exciting things are yet to be discovered.
Well, I encourage everyone to go to Thebes as quickly as you can and see that beautiful museum and read the Latsis book and really do some studying, because Thebes is just as important, if not more so, than Athens and Sparta. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Now I'm going to introduce our next speaker is Stephen Dando-Collins, and he's the acclaimed multi-award winning author of 46 books published around the world in numerous languages. The majority are nonfiction and deal with military history, ranging from ancient Greek, Roman, Persian history through World War I and World War II. And his latest book is published in the US in September and in the UK in November, and in Australia and New Zealand next year, is called Seven Against Thebes, The Quest of the Original Magnificent Seven. And this was kind of a fun book, I think, because he did use as much of the history and archaeology that is available to kind of stitch together all the Theban cycle in sort of one flowing narrative that kind of allows you to sort of experience the myth in a new and fun way. So I found it very, very interesting. And so unfortunately, it is 3 a.m. in Tasmania, so we're going to play his presentation now. I'm going to add you to Sean. I think put you up there if you want to share your screen, and just make sure you're not muted, I guess.
Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, ready to go.
Thank you, Anya, and it's a great pleasure to be a part of this presentation. The reason that I am talking about Thebes today is that recently, 2 years ago, I had a new book published in the US called Seven Against Thebes, The Quest of the Original Magnificent Seven. It'll also be published in the UK in November, Australia and New Zealand early next year. So what brought me, who generally writes about Roman history, but occasionally about Greek history, to this particular subject? This is my 46th book, by the way. Adrian Goldsworthy, the noted British author, said to me recently, please slow down, you're making the rest of us look lazy. So this book was inspired basically by a movie or several movies. You'll possibly remember the 1954 movie, The Seven Samurai, Akira Kurosawa's epic movie about 7 samurai warriors who go to help a village defend itself against attack. And this was the inspiration for the 1969 John Sturges movie, The Magnificent Seven, which had a very similar theme. But the amazing thing to me, having known about the history of Thebes for many years, was that the storyline and particularly the characters were very similar to an event that took place in the 13th century BC at Thebes. I'll just read you one paragraph from my book that discusses that similarity. The 7 principal characters in both movies bear a strong resemblance to the 7 champions in Seven Against Thebes. The ethics-driven leader, down on his luck, his brother-in-arms and first recruit, the inexperienced younger man wishing to prove himself, a traumatized fighter who dreads his impending death, and 3 hardened and skillful fighters who join the expedition with varying motives. So if you're familiar with the 1969 movie, the Magnificent Seven, we have Yul Brynner as the leader, we have Steve McQueen and Robert Vaughn and a number of other major Hollywood stars playing the roles of these 7 champions. Now, there is a difference in the story of both the 7 Samurai and the Magnificent Seven from Seven Against Thebes, and I'll explain the Seven Against Thebes story to you shortly, in that these 7 champions go to protect a village or a town, whereas in the original story of Seven Against Thebes, they go to attack it. However, there are 7 champions sponsored by that city to defend the city, so that there is a correlation there. But as I just read to you, the similarities in the characters are astonishing. And so this had me decades ago digging into the history of Thebes and the Seven Against Thebes story. We first learn about Seven Against Thebes from the Greek playwright Aeschylus. It was also, the story was also written about to one degree or another by Sophocles and also by Euripides. But the basic story was started as a play written in the 3rd century BC by Aeschylus. And it's a fascinating adventure story, but it brings in the story of Oedipus. And you may have heard of Oedipus and the fact that he killed his father and married his mother, which led Freud to come up with his Oedipus syndrome, Oedipus complex, which is not actually as allied to the original story as history portrays. But this basic story has fascinated humans right down through the centuries. So I start the book with the story of Oedipus because he becomes the king of Thebes, and his 2 sons, Polynices and Eteocles, will fight for the control of Thebes. So Oedipus is a young man. He is raised believing that he is the blood son of the king and queen of Corinth. But when he's a young man, he's at a dinner when one of the other participants in the dinner becomes drunk and tells him that he's not a blood relative of the king and queen at all. He's only adopted. And this bothers him so much that he decides to make a secret trek to Delphi. And Delphi in Greece was famous as the home of the oracle of Apollo. And if you've ever been to Delphi, it's even today a very moving and spiritual place, even though it's very much in ruins. But in those days, and right through to Roman times, Greeks and Romans, Romans later obviously, would journey to Delphi to seek a prediction from the Oracle of Delphi. And this was usually a woman chosen from the local towns. They called her the Pythia. And her job was to interpret messages which supposedly came from Apollo in answer to the questions put by the applicants. And they would pay as well as they could. If kings came, they gave vast amounts of gold and so on in payment for their requests to be answered. So Oedipus goes to Delphi incognito and asks the oracle to tell him whether he is indeed the blood son of the king and queen of Corinth. And the reply he receives, and in many cases the replies from the Oracle of Delphi and from other Greek oracles was in verse, and it was often quite jumbled, and you really had to work it out, and often you would not be able to work out the riddle, if you like, in the prediction until after the event. But this told him that he was going to kill his father and bet his mother, and he was terrified by this. And he decided that to prevent this prediction ever being fulfilled, he would not go home to Corinth. He'd flee to the farthest corners of the Greek world. And so he's on his way on foot from Delphi when he comes to a crossroads. And coming the other way is a rich man in a chariot being led by an attendant, and he has two other attendants with him in the chariot. But the man leading the chariot, once he reaches the crossroads and Oedipus joins him, pushes Oedipus aside. Now, Oedipus was a young man who could be described in quick and many things. He had a quick mind, he had a quick smile, but he also had a quick temper. And so he attacked the first attendant, the man holding the chariot. The rich man then rises up to defend himself. And the end result is that Oedipus ends up killing the rich man and two of his attendants, and a third attendant flees. And Oedipus, when he realizes what he's done, he's in fact a murderer, or could be accused of being a murderer, sets off after the third attendant, hoping to catch him and silence him so that his secret is maintained. Over many days, his chase brings him to the outskirts of the city of Thebes, but he still has not overtaken the man of his quest. But on the road, he, according to myth, he's intercepted by the Sphinx. The Greeks and the Egyptians had different concepts of Sphinx. The Greeks believed the Sphinx had the body of a lion and the head of a woman. And as I discuss in the book, it's quite possible that this Sphinx was actually a female highway robber, because the king of Athens, Theseus, encountered a female highway robber in a very similar encounter at another time. But the myth is that the Sphinx was part animal, part woman. And the Sphinx has been waylaying travelers and asking them this riddle. And if they can't answer the riddle, she kills them and eats them. But Oedipus successfully answers the riddle and in fact kills the Sphinx. He arrives in Thebes and informs the locals that he's killed the Sphinx. And it turned out that their king, Laius, had been on his way to Delphi to ask the oracle how the city could overcome the Sphinx. And so the king's brother-in-law, Creon, is acting as king, and he and the governors of Thebes offer the crown of Thebes to Oedipus. And he sees this as a very good way to hide his crime, and so he becomes king of Thebes and marries Jocasta, who is the sister of Creon, and she is the widow of King Laius. Now, at this point, we're told by the original Greek stories that Oedipus is unaware that he's now marrying his own mother. He has 4 children. He has the sons Eteocles, Polynices, the daughters Antigone and Ismene, and the time comes when he learns the truth. His wife, mother, learns the truth, and there is a great uproar, and he is forced to abdicate. And so his two sons now decide to take over the rulership of Thebes, and they decide to do it year in, year out. And at the end of the first year, they will swap for control of Thebes. And so the younger man, Eteocles, wins a contest to become the ruler for the first year. But as so often happens, once people have a taste of power, they don't like giving it up. And he refuses after the first year to hand over the throne to his brother. And he banishes Polynices. Polynices wanders through Greece and ends up at the kingdom of Argos, where he encounters another young man, Tydeus, who is the king or the heir to the throne of Calydon. And his uncle has ejected him, accusing him of murdering numerous relatives. So here we have two young men who have been banished from their own kingdoms and wish to reclaim their thrones. And so the king of Argos, Adrastus, decides that these young men with royal blood would make ideal husbands for his two unwed daughters. And he makes a proposal to them. He says, if you will marry my daughters, I will, instead of paying a dowry, I will, at a suitable time, finance and lead an army to reclaim your thrones, first Thebes and then Calydon. And so the young men agree to this, but 10 years pass, and every time they ask King Adrastus to keep his word, he fobs them off. But eventually they pin him down, and he says, oh, very well, if you can find 7 champions with royal blood to attack the 7 gates of Thebes, I will put together the army and keep my word. So now Polynices and Tydeus go out in search of the 7 champions. Obviously, they are the first 2, they need another 5. And so with various complications, overcoming various complications, they recruit another 5. There's Amphiaraus, who has royal blood connected to the throne of Argos. And he's a contemporary of Heracles, or Hercules as the Romans called him. But he has received a prediction from the Oracle of Delphi that if he attacks Thebes, he'll be killed under the walls of Thebes. And so he doesn't particularly want to go. But his wife calls him a coward and goads him into joining the 7. Then we have Hippomedon, as the name implies, is as big as a horse. He's a relative giant. And we have Capaneus, who is famous for using fire as his weapon of war. And then we have a young man called Parthenopaeus. Now he's only a teenager, and he's like the Horst Buckholz character in the first Magnificent Seven movie, who is busting to join the group, and they want nothing to do with him. And he finally convinces them to accept him. Now, Parthenopaeus was the son of Atalanta. She was a female warrior, very famous in Greek history and various myths. And he is able to convince the others that he's actually the son of King Talus, who was the son of who was the king of Thebes before Adrastus. So now we have our 7, and we have Eteocles, who is a very humble man, but he has royal blood. And so we have our 7, and they go against Thebes. On the way, there is an incident at the city of Nemea, which causes them to conduct a funeral games. And that is detailed in my book as one of the stories that lead up to the attack on Thebes. And then we get to the war on Thebes itself. And numerous authors in Roman times wrote about this same story. The most famous was Statius in AD 91 for the Saturnalia festival. He launches this book, which has taken him a book of verse, which has taken him 10 years to write. and it's his Theban, and it becomes an overnight success. And he, over the coming years, he reads to vast audiences, paying audiences, becomes famous and rich from his story. Now he elaborated on the story told by the earlier Greek authors. And many of the details that he puts in are not confirmed by any other source. So I suspect, and many other authors and historians suspect, that he was using his creative license, let us say. But it was a huge success. His story was, his version of Seven Against Thebes was famous right through Roman times, and it was a stirring adventure story. And he was linked with the earlier great Roman poets such as Virgil. So we get to the attack on Thebes. I'm not going to give away the outcome of the attack. You'll have to read my book or read the various other accounts from earlier history. But I can tell you that their sons the sons of the Seven would also figure in the war against Thebes. And we find that a generation later, several of those sons will actually, according to Homer, take part in the war against Troy. And one of them will actually be one of the Greek soldiers hiding in the belly of the Trojan horse. How true is all this? I spend some time in the latter part of my Seven Against Thebes discussing the various sources and how much we can take as fact and how much was his account was clearly invented. I'm sure my fellow presenters on this wonderful Story of Thebes presentation will talk more about how authentic the stories that came down to us from the original Greek authors are. For example, there's still speculation as to whether were there really 7 gates of Thebes. Were there more? Were there less? There was a Thebes in Egypt, for example, which became Luxor, which had 100 gates, but it was a much bigger city than Thebes. And I think at its height, I think it had a population of 100,000, where Thebes was, in the time we're talking about, was 10, 20,000. So there are lots of, there's been lots of speculation, but archaeology, as you'll also hear from another one of our presenters, has told us a lot about Thebes. But there is nothing remaining. The walls were destroyed. There's very little trace of the 7 gates. But if you visit Thebes, you'll find a pleasant little town out on a plain built around this massive rock that rises from the countryside, which housed the Cadmea, the original citadel. But you have to use your imagination to imagine Thebes as it was in the time of the 7. So my time is running out. I thank you for your time. I do hope that you have a chance to read a good book about the 7 Against Thebes or about Thebes. Several of my fellow presenters have some brilliant books about Thebes, one about its history, another one about the Sacred Band, which you may have already heard, which became the most powerful military unit in Greek history at its height. So I hope you've been enjoying and will continue to enjoy this presentation. And thank you very much to Anya Leonard and all the crew at Classical Wisdom for allowing us to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed and could watch with no issues Stephen Dando-Collins' book, about which I do highly recommend. I did thoroughly enjoy it, and he does always have an excellent hat. He's very good at storytelling, so it was very great and enjoyable book to read. So I'd like to now introduce our next panelist, next speaker, which is the one only James Romm, who was referenced in the conversation. I'm just going to add him here. James Romm is the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College and specializes in ancient Greek and Roman culture and civilization. His reviews and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and the London Review of Books. Professor Romm is the author of several books, including Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero, Ghost on the Throne, The Death of Alexander the Great, and most recently, The Sacred Band, 300 Theban Lovers Fighting to Save Greek Freedom, of which we've done an event on the Sacred Band. And it's my pleasure, as always, to welcome James back to our event. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Anya. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect. I'm going to take myself off and let you take over.
Okay, very good. Well, first I want to reassure Paul Cartledge, who noted my absence, that I was here for his presentation. I just had a little trouble logging on, but I did hear you, Paul, your wonderful presentation, and the other speakers as well. So we've had a mixture of historical and factual side of Thebes and the mythic side. So I'm going to be talking about a story which I believe is factual, but there are some who believe is mythical, the story of the Sacred Band. So I can get into a little bit of that controversy, but I believe that the information we have about the band, which is not much, is historically accurate. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that being shared properly? No, here we go. All right. So this is an image that was composed digitally for my book on the Sacred Band by the digital illustrator Mark Lee Boyer. It compiles 82 separate drawings that were made by the excavator Stamatakis in the 1880s of the mass grave that he excavated at Chaeronea underneath the monument, the Lion of Chaeronea. So this rectangular space up at the top is the base of the lion. There are 254 skeletons here, laid out in 7 rows. A standard Greek phalanx has 8 rows, so it's curious that there's only 7 rows here, because the effort seems to have been to bury these men in phalanx formation. It's also curious that there's 254 skeletons, because we know from our sources that the Sacred Band, the elite infantry regiment of the Thebans, had 300 members. Well, it's quite possible that some bodies were lost, or some survived the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. But we can only speculate. Stamatakis, as we know from his logs, identified this grave with the grave of the Sacred Band. There's no markings or inscriptions or objects that would make that a secure identification. And it's possible to raise questions about that. But most scholars believe, and I believe my colleagues here on the panel believe, that this is the tomb of the Sacred Band. The Lion of Chaeronea over the tomb indicates that these men died with special honor and were buried with special honor. It was an honor for Greek soldiers to be buried on the battlefield rather than in their home cities. So that's the image I wanted to show you. Let me come back out of sharing if I can do that. Okay. So what were the Sacred Bands? They apparently were formed in the year 379 BC, a very important year for Thebes. 3 years earlier, in 382, the Spartans had virtually occupied the city by stationing a garrison on the Cadmea, that high ground that dominates the city and is almost unassailable from below. A Spartan force had been stationed there, and Spartan puppets had been put in charge of Thebes, and the city had virtually been made a protectorate of Sparta, much to the dismay of the more patriotic Thebans, especially the more democratically minded Thebans. Some of those had taken up exile in the city of Athens, and from there they plotted a way to return and take their city back. In 379, a group of exiles made their way back through Boeotia and snuck back into the city at night. We're told by Plutarch, who tells the story at great length, that there were only 12 men led by a fellow named Pelopidas, whom Paul Cartledge referred to earlier. 12 men who were dedicated to throwing out the Spartans and taking the city back. They disguised themselves as women and were infiltrated into a party being held for the Spartan puppet leadership, who were all expecting female sexual partners for that evening. Can everyone see me okay? Is the transmission okay?
Perfect. I can hear you perfectly.
I've just had a change in my screen to your logo, Anya, but is my picture coming across?
Yep, I see you perfectly. I just turned off my video for a second to help the streaming, but you seem to be perfect.
Okay, good. So disguised as women, they were infiltrated into this sex party and assassinated the leadership of the Spartan puppet government, and then besieged the garrison on the hilltop of the Cadmea. Remarkably, due to some failures of leadership and the breakdown in the chain of command, the Spartans on that hilltop surrendered and were allowed to leave the city under a grant of safe passage. This was humiliating for Sparta. They had been forced to give up territory and a very important political position that they regarded as their own. The Thebans knew that Spartan retribution was coming, especially because Sparta was commanded by a man named Agesilaus, a man whom Paul Cartledge has biographied, who was a very determined and militaristic commander who was spreading Spartan power as far as he was able. The Sacred Band was formed in that year, directly after the formation of this new Theban government, as a way to protect the city and especially defend it against Sparta. We're told by Plutarch, who supplies us really our only substantive information, that the Thebans drafted pairs of male lovers, 150 couples, so 300 men, on the principle that male lovers would fight to defend one another and their fighting spirit would be greater than any other infantry force. Now, Plutarch gives two different explanations for this principle. One is that lovers feel shame in one another's eyes to do anything cowardly. That is, they want to excel and win the admiration of their beloved. He also uses the analogy of horse racing. He says teams of horses, yoked pairs of horses, are known to race faster than horses running alone. I don't know that this is true, but this is what Plutarch says, because the two horses rival one another and spur one another on. So they're essentially racing each other. So those are his two different approaches to the psychology of the sacred band, why it was deemed to be such a potent fighting force. He also says that it was alternatively called the city band because it was housed and trained on the Cadmea by the city. In other words, Thebes chose to make it a standing army in service year-round, rather than drafted as needed in the way that most ancient soldiers were, and to supervise its maintenance and training as a civic responsibility, more like a modern army, or more like the Spartan army, because the Spartans were the only city in Greece that was essentially maintaining a standing army year-round. The band was originally, according to our sources, spread out across the front line of the Theban phalanx. That is, it formed a kind of frontal layer. If a phalanx is 8 deep, maybe the first 1 or 2 men in each row were members of the sacred band. Then over time, over the next few years, its organization was changed. It was massed as a unit that is kept together in block formation, and lovers were stationed side by side, which had not been done originally. And that innovation is credited to Pelopidas, the leader of the overthrow of the Spartans, who had by this time also been made the commander of the sacred band. With this new formation, the band proved able to hurl itself. They're compared to a spearhead of the army, that is the point of maximum impact. They were able to hurl themselves and penetrate the Spartan line in the first 2 engagements against the Spartans. And finally, the third and most important engagement was the Battle of Leuctra in 371. So over the course of 8 years, the Thebans had fought off Spartan invasions a couple of times and had tried to take back the territory of Boeotia, which had been under Spartan control for the preceding decade. Finally, a showdown took place on the fields of Leuctra in Boeotia, where Pelopidas used the sacred band in this spearhead-like way to launch itself not just at the Spartan line, but at the strongest Spartan position, the place where their king was stationed and their elite force of the knights. So the very center, or the strong point of the Spartan line. In most infantry battles up to this time, both sides put their strongest troops on their own right, facing the weaker troops of the enemy. This time, the Thebans elected to put their strongest troops up against the strongest troops of the Spartans and smash them on the first impact. The king was mortally wounded, the army was put to rout, and 400 Spartan soldiers, a huge percentage of their fighting force, was left dead on the field. This was an epochal event in Greek history. It was the first time the Spartans had been defeated in open field battle. It punctured the myth of Spartan invincibility and led to an enormous shift in the balance of power among the Greek city-states. Thebes essentially became the superpower of mainland Greece. The 370s and 360s were, as I call them in my book, the age of the sacred band. This was the era when Thebes was flourishing as a democracy and projecting power to other parts of the Greek world. fighting against the tyrant of Thessaly, Jason of Pherae, invading the Peloponnese, which no one had attempted to do because of Sparta's dominance there, freeing enormous numbers of Spartan slaves called helots, the liberation that Paul Cartledge referred to, and building the city of Messene in the west of the Peloponnese. If you've never been to Messene, and this is to be distinguished from Mycenae, which is a different site entirely. So Messene, Messene, in the west of the Peloponnese, is a very well-preserved, fascinating Greek site. Not very well visited, but well worth a trip. And especially when one considers that the walls of Messene, some of which are still fairly intact, were built in the course of only weeks by the army of the Thebans, including the Sacred Band. What was the city built for? It was to safeguard the freedom of the Helots, the Spartan slaves who had been freed in the previous invasion, and make sure that Sparta could never reclaim them. They were the foundation stone of Spartan power because they enabled the Spartan economy to function without the need for the Spartan soldiers, the Spartiates, to be distracted from war making. They were essential to Sparta's power, and the Thebans, by extracting them and guaranteeing their safety, guaranteed that Sparta would not return as a major power. So much is told to us by Plutarch in his life of Pelopidas. It's been called into question by a man named David Leitao, who about 15 years ago published an article suggesting that this was a myth based on Platonic notions of erotic love. He notes that Plutarch is several centuries after the time of the Sacred Band, and the contemporary evidence is very thin or non-existent. Of course, we do have the tomb, the mass grave, which is, to my mind, a considerable body of evidence, but it's possible to claim that that is not the tomb of the Sacred Band. I would argue that the reason why the contemporary sources are silent, contemporary meaning mid-4th century BC, our primary source for that period is a man named Xenophon, whose Hellenica is the go-to source for the history of this period. Xenophon was immensely philo-Spartan. He believed the Spartans were really the master race of the Greeks and deserved to be its leaders and its superpower. He despised Thebans. Paul Cartledge alluded earlier to the idea of Boeotian swine. Well, Xenophon was one of those who thought of them as swine and disliked enormously their achievements against Sparta. He's silent about the Sacred Band, although he does note that they had an elite infantry corps in one of his descriptions of a Theban battle. But otherwise, he keeps silent about them. He also keeps silent about the foundation of Messene, one of the most significant events of his time. He never mentions it. So I don't think one can put a lot of weight onto the silence of Xenophon, and he is really the bulk of our evidence from this period, our contemporary evidence. So Plutarch takes our story down to the year 364, which is the death of Pelopidas, and then we know that Epaminondas, the other great leader of Thebes, died 2 years later. The Sacred Band continued as a fighting force on the Theban side for the next 30 years. But we have almost no evidence about them. Our next piece of evidence comes from the Battle of Chaeronea in 338, when Thebes had allied with Athens to try to resist Philip of Macedon, the new superpower in the Greek world, from making incursions from the north into central Greece. They stood together, Thebes and Athens, at the Battle of Chaeronea, and against Philip and his son Alexander, soon to be Alexander the Great, at that time only 16 years old, and fighting in his first major battle. Alexander was given the task of facing the sacred band. And again, we're relying on Plutarch. He penetrated such that he split the Theban band off from the rest of the line, surrounded them, and annihilated them to a man. This, to my mind, was a deliberate strategy on the part of the Macedonians to show the Greeks their dominance and their capacity for cruelty, that there was not going to be any mercy shown to this most iconic, most potent Greek fighting force. So that takes us back to the tomb. We have those 254 skeletons laid out in 7 rows, most of them showing the wounds of death in battle, blade marks on the bones, in some cases weapons still stuck into rib cages. Fascinating evidence for osteologists about the way that men fought and died in ancient infantry battles. And the monument erected over them, the Lion of Chaeronea, which, unlike most ancient monuments, has no inscription and nothing to identify what it commemorates. But its expression and its attitude, looking out over the battlefield, suggests that it marks a memorial of an honorific Greek infantry unit who died in that battle. So I'll leave it there and invite your questions.
Thank you so much, James, as always. Here, let me add myself up here with you. Absolutely fantastic. We actually have quite a few questions, so maybe we'll just dive right in. Did the sacred band face discrimination from ancient city-states, and why was Xenophon anti-Theban?
So,
two-parter.
To take the second question first, I alluded to Xenophon's philo-Spartanism. He was a tremendous admirer of Agesilaus. He fought under him as a soldier, as a sub-commander, and wrote a hagiographic biography of him, which survives. So Spartans to him were, the bee's knees. And the fact that the Thebans had made short work of them, had taken them down several notches, really got under his skin. The Thebans he thought of as a culturally inferior people, and for them to have challenged and defeated the Spartans was really irksome.
Yeah, that was a burn, basically.
That would burn.
Did the Athenians, did all the other city-states feel the same way? Was it just Sparta, or kind of just pan-Hellenic hatred of Thebes?
Well, not so much hatred as contempt. Yes, the Athenians felt a certain contempt. You can see it in the way that Thebans are portrayed in their comedies, are made fun of. They spoke, a kind of rustic Greek. They didn't have a literary culture. They had no great, except for Pindar, they had no great writers or thinkers. They were, a rustic people, and the Greeks generally thought of them as lower, as a lower form of culture. What was remind me of the first question, because I wanted to get back to that.
Well, that was why why Xenophon was anti-Theban, and did they face discrimination from other city-states?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the question was about whether the sacred band, faced discrimination on the basis of their homosexuality. And so that's a complicated question. Ancient attitudes toward male homosexuality varied widely. And one can point to texts like Plato's Symposium, where it's entirely accepted and embraced. And one can look at Aristophanes, where it's made fun of and mocked. So it's not a simple matter. We know that Thebes was uniquely supportive and open about male homosexuality. They revered the figures of Heracles and Iolaus, who were thought to be lovers, and whose graves were shown at Thebes. We know that men took vows of fidelity to one another, almost like gay marriage, at Thebes, not known elsewhere in Greece. So the Thebans had a unique, a gay-friendly culture, let's say, compared with other Greek cities.
I have a few comments, but I still want to read them out. That talking about army, it will also be good to mention that at the Battle of Thermopylae, along with the 300 Spartans, there were 400 Thebans and 700 Thespians remained on the battle, which I think was I think according to Herodotus, though, was it?
Yes, well, the 400 Thebans did not distinguish themselves. As was noted by Paul Cartledge, they went over to the Persian side as soon as it was clear that it was that or death. They very quickly threw down their weapons and said, "Hey, we're with you," and they were vilified for that ever afterward.
Is it historically essential to know whether they were 150 couples or separate individuals, since Xenophon is an amazingly unreliable source of information?
Yes, well, in spite of his reluctance to name the sacred band, Xenophon does say, not in his Hellenica, but in his Symposium, that the Thebans stationed their lovers side by side in battle. He gives you a very negative reading of that. He says it's so that they prevent one another from deserting. That's how anti-Theban he is, that the only reason they do that is because otherwise they would just desert. So he does note the stationing side by side of male lovers in battle, which seems to, inescapably to me, to confirm the legend that Plutarch tells of the sacred band.
Was there any jealousy or rivalries among so many lovers?
Well, the rivalry between members of a couple is given by Plutarch as part of the reason for the band's success. The analogy of the two racehorses that are yoked together and racing one another. As to whether couples competed against other couples, I don't think we have any information, but I guess that would be natural. Just as all soldiers in battle were, at some level competing to show bravery.
Okay, our last question, since we're running out of time, and this is referring to Paul's man, Epaminondas. Was he involved in any way with the sacred band?
Yes, well, to a degree. Epaminondas was the guiding figure of Thebes during its ascendancy, not quite from 379, but from shortly thereafter, until his death in 362. He never led the band himself, but he put his second in command, Pelopidas, in charge of the band. he and Pelopidas seem to have had a uniquely cooperative relationship. They were not lovers themselves, but they seem to have worked hand in glove throughout the period of Theban hegemony. And so one has to believe that they were collaborating on strategy, on how best to use the band in battle.
Well, thank you so much, James, once again. I really thoroughly enjoyed your book. We'll be sending out links as well so everybody can read it for themselves, because it is a fantastic and fascinating chapter of history that I think historically has been a bit of cold history. So it's interesting to sort of bring it back to light now that we can, really. So I want to thank you again for joining us. And then we're going to, for everybody, I know we're kind of reaching the end of people's attention spans, but we have one last segment. So I am going to put you on to Sean to introduce everybody while I get our last panelist. If you can't continue to stay with us, don't worry, we will have a recording of everything. But this is going to be a very fascinating last discussion. So Sean,
So for our final is a panel titled The Absence of Thebes, which will feature Elton Barker, who is professor of Greek literature and culture at the School of Arts and Cultures at the Open University in Milton Keynes, United Kingdom. In addition to his book on Homer's Thebes with Joel Christensen, he is author of Entering the Aegon, Descent and Authority in Homer, Historiography and Tragedy, and is helping to develop a digital ecosystem of methods and tools for humanists, largely in his capacity as the partnership secretary of the Pelagios Network. And he'll be joined by Joel Christensen, who is professor in the Department of Classical and Early Mediterranean Studies at Brandeis University, where he also serves as Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs. In addition to his and Elton's joint books, he is author of The Many-Minded Man, The Odyssey, Psychology, and the Therapy of Epic, Myth and Poetics 2. So those are our panelists. And are we ready to go?
Yep. Okay. So thank you, Elton and Joel, for joining us today. It's great to have you guys here to talk about the absence of Thebes.
Thanks, Sonia. Hey, Elton.
Hey, Joel. Where am I? I can't see you. This is very strange.
Right
I can hear you, but I can't see
screen.
you. Really?
Now, I'd love to just get started off with, I mean, you guys wrote this book about Homer's lack of Thebes, but let's get to the idea that, Thebes was once considered equal to Troy. So how did it lose so much significance?
It's easier asked than answered, I think. Elton, do you want to start or should I?
No. You have a go first. I think you have to go. I always push the difficult questions onto Joel. So,
so Anya, I think. Well, first, thank you for having us, and I also want to thank Paul, James, and everyone who came before for the great setup you gave us, and apologize to everyone paying attention for what we may give in response, which is sort of more questions. But I think our work for a long time has been motivated by the cultural forces, the aesthetics that shape the Homeric epics as we have them. And so many years ago, Elton showed up in New York to give a talk at Columbia University. It was very rainy, my apartment flooded, and he said, oh, by the way, we need to write the talk before I give it. And so we spent a few days holed up in a basement in Astoria, thinking about Oedipus and the Odyssey, which is really the start of this work. And the thing that was interesting to us is that what happens with Oedipus in the Odyssey when he's mentioned is we hear a story from really Odysseus talking about when he sees Oedipus's mother in the underworld, and then the story he tells is very different from what you might expect from Sophocles or from anything else. Oedipus did in fact sleep with his mom, but then he heard about it, and then she hanged herself, and he went on to be like a king of Thebes. And so that started us out thinking about what Homeric poetry does with Thebes and with what we think of as rival traditions. And so the way we think about it and the way we started in our book is that in Hesiod's Works and Days, when he's giving the story of the myth of the metals and the generations of men, he says that Zeus created the Trojan War and the Theban War, not in that order, to get rid of the race of heroes. And this is consonant as well with that fragmentary beginning of the poem, the Cypria, where it talks about Zeus coming up with a plan to get rid of the race of heroes. And so we're interested in the way that Thebes comes first, and then Troy comes second. Then everything in Homer seems to completely suppress anything going on with Thebes, much to the extent that even when you get to the contingents of soldiers and sailors coming to Troy, Thebes is sort of left out. You know, the logical reason is, well, Thebes has been destroyed recently, but there are really sort of what we might consider muscular statements throughout the Iliad about how Thebes is less significant than Troy, and how it's in the past. Most significantly, I think, in book 4 of the Iliad, when Sthenelus, who's a cousin, best friend of Diomedes, says, you know, like, we're better than our fathers. We sacked Thebes and they didn't, and now we're here. And of course, Diomedes and Sthenelus are the second 7 against Thebes, the Epigonoi, and their fathers were the failures. So, you know, I'll hand it off to Elton in a second, but this started off sort of a set of questions and investigations on our part that really culminates in a larger cultural, even civic and political attempt to appropriate from Thebes in raising up Athens and making the Homeric narrative the most significant one. And the Homeric narrative, we think, was probably the most significant one as well, under the social and historical pressure of the Greek wars with Persia. And so that's sort of a big overview of where we go, but there are many details along the way to get there. Elton?
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up a couple of the details in a minute, but I think what we want to talk about in this last session is to tackle Paul's title of Forgotten, the city, Thebes, a forgotten city, and really think about Thebes as the suppressed city, the erased city in Homer, actually. So Joel's given you a couple of passages, and I just want to dig into them a little bit more, because when people tend to look for Thebes in Homer, they're looking for Thebes in Homer in order to try to reconstruct Theban epic. That's a common scholarly strategy. We're having to do that, of course, because we have no Theban epic. We have the Iliad, we have the Odyssey, both very strongly connected to the other city of ancient Greek hexameter epic, Troy, but we have no surviving hexameter poetry related to Thebes. Though we have the occasional fragment, though we have later summaries, though we have, of course, a wealth of visual evidence, and of course, all the plots from Sophocles' tragedy that the other speakers have already talked about. So we're pretty confident that there would have been these other epic tales. So, you know, one way to think about this is, you know, what's happened? Why do we not get? Why does Thebes not survive? Not so much, like I said, not so much forgotten as erased. So just to pick up on the two passages that Joel has talked about, to give you a sense of our approach. That passage in the Odyssey, when we get the mention of Oedipus, what's really interesting there, in addition to what Joel has said, is that Oedipus is described by Odysseus, we shouldn't forget, as of many pains, that Oedipus has suffered many pains. And that's a really interesting one of these formulae, one of these repeated phrases that crop up a lot in both Homeric epics, but specifically in Odyssey in association with Odysseus. So there's here a point of contact, and Odysseus is in fact drawing attention to this point of contact between himself and this other potential epic hero, Oedipus, who suffered these many pains, just like Odysseus is suffering these many pains in the underworld. So the point here being that as we get this reference to this other tradition, a very brief, elusive, and in many ways very kind of weird reference, because it doesn't give us any of the narrative tropes that we would expect with a knowledge of Theban myth from later. We get this very kind of skewed vision. All this is to serve the person who is telling us this tale, Odysseus. So we see here how Theban myth, how Theban tradition, the very language is being twisted in order to project the new hero, the greatest hero, the greatest suffering hero of them all, and that's Odysseus. And similarly, in the Iliad, this is a really good setup, because initially the context for what Joel was saying about Sthenelus and Diomedes is the context is that we have Agamemnon berating the troops. I mean, it's his idea that to by shouting at them, he's going to make them fight harder. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong with the leadership of Agamemnon, and this being one of them, I think. And in order to provoke Diomedes into action, he talks about his father Tydeus, and how Tydeus, was, the great hero who fought at Thebes, and that's why we then get the response from Sthenelus about, it's all for you very well telling us about Tydeus, but we are the ones who sacked Thebes. So here we have a really nice, it's been really put on the agenda of the Iliad that the war at Thebes, first of all, is prior to what had happened at Troy. It didn't have to be like that. We learn later, actually, in the Iliad, that Heracles himself has sacked Troy before. So one can imagine a Theban epic that might tell the tale of Troy being sacked before Thebes being sacked. And it's really important, that priority that John mentioned, that we get from Hesiod, actually, that sense that we've had the sack of Thebes, the sack that only happened, of course, with the Epigonoi, and so not the Magnificent Seven, but the sons of the Magnificent Seven. So that's Diomedes and Sthenelus in that crew, but also that it wasn't sufficient. That wasn't sufficient to resolve Zeus's plan, which is the destruction of the generation of heroes. Thebes is insufficient. We need Troy for that. And so this is, again, one example, I think, where we have Theban epic, I wouldn't even say being quoted, it's being very elusively referred to, and again, not the canonical thematic themes or issues that we can derive from other sources, but very elusively. We get this reference to Thebes in order to serve the narrative that is being promoted here, whether that's the Iliad or the Odyssey. That's really our pitch. So looking for references in Homer, not so much to try to reconstruct Theban epic, but to think about how Homer is twisting and misrepresenting Theban epic in order to serve the agenda of his poems.
And to follow up just for a minute, Anya, sorry, you are on mute, and to take it back up to some of Paul's first comments, I think it's a long-term process that amounts to the erasure or the expropriation of Theban culture, right? I mean, we do have, Thebes sort of going on the outs when it sides with Persia in 486, and then actually raised in 335, but all around, you have this sort of silencing or sort of avoidance of the raising up of Theban culture. Paul and others mentioned Pindar as a crucial poet, but we also have Corinna, we have Bacchylides, we have a lively art and cultural life that I would dare say is far beyond what you may have had in the Peloponnese at Sparta. And so, the stories that would have been told about Thebes would have been legion. We have this entire mythscape around the city, and we have an epic called, or evidence of an epic called the Thebes, that according to ancient authors was like the third best epic in antiquity, like almost up there with the Iliad and the Odyssey. So good that some people compared it to Homer.
Joel, can I just say thank you, because I have construction outside of my house, but my next question was literally going to be, can you tell us a bit about Homer's epic rivals and the songs of the Boeotian Thebes? So I think it is important. I think people forget that, Homer wasn't just the only guy making up songs, but were a lot of these songs written, or were they more of the oral tradition?
So this is always dangerous for me to summarize what Elton and I believe, because we change our minds over time. But I think we tend
are,
to see
and we
all...
are, we are. I should also say we are different people as well. So
Right.
Good
But
to remember.
we tend to lean on the oral tradition side of things, and see these narrative traditions as being sort of, fossilized, textualized versions of oral traditions. And so, something like the Thebes or the other Theban epic, the Oedipodea, or even Theban epic, or even epics associated with Heracles, would have been different possibilities in performance oral traditions. And we do have some fragments that have been written down, both in the Epigonoi and Thebes, and some from the Oedipodea. Elton.
And I was just going to come in there, Annie. I mean, answer to your question, I think this is a real problem with Thebes and Homer, is that because it's oral, it doesn't get written down. So it's not like we can look at later epic like Virgil or Apollonius of Rhodos or Statius, where you can see the impact of intertextuality and that competitive agonistic relation with other epics, other genres. It's very difficult to talk about that with the Iliad and Odyssey, because we have no rivals apart from, you could say, Hesiod. And this is because it's part of an oral culture. And as soon as it gets written down, then it becomes fossilized. It's no longer part of that sense of almost and you get, of course, scenes of this. I wouldn't say reconstructed, but you get glimpses of it in the Odyssey, where you have a poet performing in front of an audience and telling the tale to serve that audience, to have a point that's going to attract the audience. So you really get a nice sense there, I think, of the importance an audience has actually in the construction of the tale. And all this gets lost as soon as it gets written down. And that's really the fundamental reason why we don't have a written Theban epic, because it would have been like with both Homeric epics that have survived, it would have been an oral epic, and we only now have the title and a much later summary.
And I think to add to that, there are other complicating features as well that I think are analogous to archaeological records. And the first is that so many of the fragments we have from poems that were lost were preserved in order to illustrate things that were considered canon or canonized, right? Like many of our fragments of what's called this epic cycle are preserved in scholarly commentaries for the Iliad and the Odyssey. Similarly, so much of what we have from the Theban traditions, the fragments, are preserved by scholars who are trying to tell us about Athenian plays about Theban topics, right? So it's tertiary and quaternary. And what really happens is that the manuscript traditions that gets preserved in Hellenistic cities are primarily Athenocentric in really significant ways. So Athens doesn't just sort of win when Alexander the Great raises Thebes, but it has a secondary and sort of enduring victory because of its political and economic power in the 5th century. It preserves and creates manuscript traditions and then communicates them into the future in a way that we don't get from Thebes and from Sparta. So that sort of political power combined with sort of the political will to erase other cities' memories really complicates, our confidence in what we can say about Theban traditions.
I have a question that sort of follows on that. When you talk about between Theban and Homeric epic, it naturally makes me think of tragedy and the fact that the two most frequently used mythic cycles within tragedy are Thebes and the House of Atreus. And I was wondering, is the fact that those two stories keep recurring in tragedy, that is in itself a manifestation of this rivalry, do you think, in a more
Yeah,
indirect way?
yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's really interesting to explore that actually further because unlike with epic, what Joel and I have been talking about, with tragedy, you have both surviving. So you have both the Theban cycle, you have also the Trojan cycle. What's really interesting there is that the Trojan cycle plays avoid what Homer has done. They do the bits in between, focus on the women, especially, the very much the victims of the Trojan War, or very short episode, for example, Ajax, which is only again alluded to in Homer. So you see tragedy there, very much avoiding what Homer has done, and I think that's again one really important reason why Thebes becomes such an important presence on the Athenian stage is that there's that loss of that epic tradition. So Thebes, in many ways, it has all this rich material to draw upon. And there's also, I think, one other fundamental point that goes back to something that Joel mentioned before about the big question: why is it that we have the Iliad and Odyssey and no Theban epic? And that's again thinking of the different uses to which these cities are serving. So one can imagine, and you can look at this with Thebes and Troy on the tragic stage. Troy is that international city. It's the city where Greeks are in a coalition fighting against the other. Very much, thinking of tragedy, at least thinking very much in the aftermath of the Persian Wars. We've had this foreign threat, and you can also imagine the Homeric poems having that international angle where Troy is the international city. In tragedy, Thebes becomes a really important city because it's the city where you can really explore civil conflict. And Thebes, this is a famous thesis by Froma Zeitlin, where Thebes on the tragic stage is the anti-Athens. It's where the bad stuff happens. And so everything that is, what we'd imagine as good in Athens is democratic. We wouldn't have any of those problems. We don't have incest or anything like that. In Thebes, incest becomes this kind of political issue, it being the other city. And we can think about the role that might have also played in Homer, how the Trojan War cycle does a better job at responding to changing times, where Greeks are moving across the Mediterranean, coming into contact with other peoples, perhaps even those beginnings of the conflict on the Ionian coast between Greeks and others, particularly the Persians, whereas Thebes, given its location on the Greek mainland, doesn't do such a good job at speaking to these contemporary trends.
Just to add, I think Elton got all the notes there just right. But to add a little bit of the temporal perspective, my suspicion here is that Athens had a bit of envy, or Athenians had a bit of envy vis-a-vis Boeotian myth early in the period. I mean, you can see, rivalry and depictions of Theseus and Heracles early on. And you especially then see in tragedy this attempt to appropriate, but then put Thebans in their space. And one thing that Elton mentions about sort of the Troy being a more convenient sort of vehicle for thinking about the international world, we can see a confirmation of this in a way in the speeches of someone like Isocrates, who lived to a sort of really old age, and he was almost like the Cato of Athens, right? Constantly saying, Persia must be destroyed, and really, trying to give this vision of the Greeks united that is echoed in Troy. And we can't forget, echoed in the Trojan epics, and we can't forget that Alexander, at least by Plutarch and others, is depicted as walking into Asia with the Iliad in his hand and really being inspired by this. And, as apocryphal as this might seem, I think it's a good echo of what many Greeks were thinking of at the time, of this heroic age when the Greeks were Greek and the enemies were Persian, and everybody knew what to do with their time.
Now, one thing I'd like to just
Oh,
ask, if I can, just because this is a few questions that we had asked beforehand, and I want to make sure we have time for it because I know you guys, that we want to make sure I get some time to it. And that is a bit to do with also the sacred band, that would the concept of, this homosexual relationships have resulted in the Christian monks not wanting to preserve works about Thebes? Was this sort of notion that they were very gay friendly damaging for them in being able to sort of survive the gauntlets of time?
I mean, my take on this is that most of the damage to Thebes was done long before we had Christian monks to erase it, right? I mean, I think the multiple destructions of the city, the actions of Athens and others did all that work for them. And then later on, there just wasn't enough for people to get really incensed about.
Yeah, and I think I want to come back to this idea of oral poetics, and particularly oral agonistic poetics, and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, particularly Iliad, I think. Just a couple of things, really. We know that the Iliad is the Troy story, right? It's about the Greeks, the Achaeans at Troy fighting the Trojans. So there's a sense of an international dimension that we talked about before. But what's really interesting in the Iliad is that for the majority of the Iliad, the Achaeans aren't the ones doing the besieging. They are the ones besieged because Achilles has withdrawn from the fighting. And not only that, so that's already one aspect of Theban myth that we see being appropriated by the Iliad. But it goes further than that. We are told, and very elusively, we're told that the Achaeans build walls around their camp, around their ships. This is Nestor's instructions, precisely because Achilles is no longer there to protect them. And at one point, we learn that 7 captains, 7 commanders are stationed at each of the gates. So here we have the 7 gates of Thebes, and the 7 gated Thebes is the one epithet that Homer, the Iliad, both the Iliad and Odyssey, both use. One to describe the foundations of Thebes in the Odyssey, and the other time to describe the destruction of Thebes in the Iliad. So this is a magnetic, very powerful repeated phrase, the 7 gated Thebes, and yet in the Iliad, it's the Achaeans themselves who are being besieged. You see how Homer, how the Iliad has appropriated that particular Theban, very, very iconic Theban legend. And just one other thing, I know Joel is eager to leap in here. We are also told that Achilles tells us at the beginning of the Iliad that he has sacked Thebes, but this Thebes that he is talking about, the Thebes, which is actually the hometown of Andromache, it's the Thebes where he got Briseis. So this is really a kind of the catalyst of the whole Iliad, his sacking of Thebes. But of course, it's not that Thebes. It's another Thebes, a Thebes that has been literally relocated to the Troad. So most of the references to Thebes or Thebe in the Iliad aren't actually to the 7 gated Thebes. It's to this other Thebes that is serving as some kind of, again, an absent presence. Going back to Paul's idea about the forgotten city, this erased city in the Iliad. Go on, Joe.
No, I wanted to raise up Stephanie Larson's comment in the chat that the Athenians, they took Theban myth because it was pretty cool, and they tried to update it and make it their own. I mean, you don't appropriate things that don't have some value to you, right? And in doing so, I think they're doing exactly what Elton is talking about, that Homeric epic does with Theban myth. It takes something that people know that's popular, it changes it, it makes it its own, and then runs with it.
Well, guys, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time, and I want to say thank you to all of our fantastic audience for sticking with this. And I want to kind of finish with this last comment that was put in the chat, and it was a question to all the speakers: is, do you know a city around the world with a great civilization, important not only in a short period in the past, with at least 15 complete destructions and a continuous real life today? Which I think is pretty phenomenal. Paul, do you have something to add to that?
Nothing to add. I saw the point in the chat, which is brilliant. I wondered if that person maybe had a stake in. Sorry, it's an awful fun, but whether or not he was maybe a Theban or Theban by descent or by maybe by appropriation. Well, who knows?
Well, I want to say thank you to you all. Thank you to Paul Cartledge, to Stephanie Larson, to James Romm, to Stephen Dando-Collins, to Elton Barker and Joel Christensen, and as well to Sean Kelly for helping on this event. You guys are it's been fantastic. I hope everybody's enjoyed learning about this city that really has not entered the consciousness, but as we can see, has so much importance and relevance into the ancient world. So I hope we've done our small part to contribute to bringing back Thebes. So thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, Anya. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.